Hello and welcome to Lesson 4 in this 12-lesson resource guide or e-course on how to give your child a classical Christian education at home. I'm Dennis Oliver Woods, headmaster at Kingsway Classical Academy, the world's first online classical Christian school for grades 7 through 12. Today we're looking at the life of John Adams in this last of our series, Famous Americans Who Were Homeschooled. Our learning objective is to demonstrate the high level of academic and social competence produced by homeschooling of early Americans like John Adams compared to the inferior product of modern public schools. Another famous homeschooler from the colonial era was John Adams. Adams was a contemporary of George Washington, and he became his successor in the presidency. But while George Washington was tall and dignified, John Adams was short and not quite so refined. Hailing from Puritan Boston, Adams managed to avoid the Masonic intrigues of the two Virginians who surrounded him in the presidency, Washington, who preceded him, and Jefferson, who succeeded him. Now, one of the big criticisms we often hear is that homeschool children lack social skills because they're stuck at home, they don't get to interact with other kids of their own age. Actually, the exact opposite is true. Children whose primary interaction is with adults, especially their parents, mature much faster than kids whose primary role models are other children. In fact, it's the peer pressure from other children that's almost always negative and forces most of them to conform to the lowest common denominator. Today, the worst-case scenario is becoming more and more the norm, in which kids are pressured into gangs and the associated culture of drugs and violence. In this cultural mix, some kids will rise to the top and become perpetrators of the evil. Others are intimidated, bullied, seriously damaged emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. So parents need to protect their children from this kind of negative influence in the government schools. By contrast, Washington and Adams are both examples of how exposure to adults in the homeschool environment produces a child who is well adapted to assume the responsibilities of adult life. They are, in fact, much better equipped to assume the duties of leadership, and in both of these cases, President of the United States. Now, of course, this goes against the grain of the modern government school movement that was swept into existence with false claims that early Americans were not well educated and that the poor could not afford education. But the American colonists were, in fact, among the most well-read people of their time, and this was especially true in regions where Christianity held the greatest sway. Particularly in the New England area, the literacy rate in New England among boys was at least 75% and 65% among girls. There was an aggressive missionary movement among the Indians in the South that also gave them high literacy rates as well. These achievements among the Indians were tragically wiped out and obliterated by Andrew Jackson's brutal forced relocation of the Indians west of the Mississippi in what is known as the Trail of Tears. Today, after a century and a half of exorbitantly expensive government education, we still have no more than 75% of Americans considered to be illiterate. In fact, a 2013 study of the National Center for Educational Statistics found literacy of U.S. adults trailing those in 12 other developed nations. Even worse, American adults ranked 19th among 21 countries compared in mathematics ability. Like Washington, John Adams was a farm boy who made it big in the city. Growing up in Braintree, Massachusetts, John often accompanied his father to town hall meetings. There he was exposed to the rough and tumble of spirited debate, which undoubtedly influenced his decision to become a lawyer, even though his father wanted him to enter the ministry. One of his first cases was a successful defense of the British soldiers that were involved in the Boston Massacre. And although this was unpopular with many of the patriots, it helped to establish Adams' reputation as a skilled, determined, and independent orator. This legal experience set the stage for John and his cousin Samuel to prove their patriotism as leaders in the revolutionary cause, and especially when Adams helped to draft the Declaration of Independence, one of 3 men who did that. He was taught to read by his mother and later was tutored in reading and writing with a group of children by a neighbor lady in a nearby dame school. And this was an early example of the homeschool co-op, or what we sometimes call the cottage school. Today, online schools like KingswayClassicalAcademy.com are carrying this concept to the entire world through the internet. But this led John Adams, in the case of John Adams, led to studies in Latin, which paved the way for his admission to Harvard at the age of just 15. He went on to become a signer of the Declaration of Independence, ambassador to France and the Netherlands, Vice President of the United States, and eventually President. Now, one of the common themes you may have noticed in many of these homeschoolers is an emphasis on the classical studies, where at least part of their studies sometimes involved reading classical literature and then learning Latin. The education of John Adams, like so many of the founding generation, apparently allowed this classical literature to overshadow biblical truth. Now, this is not to argue that the founders were not familiar with the Bible and they sometimes quoted it or made pronouncements of a religious nature. But unfortunately, this religious language has confused many modern-day Christians who are easily fooled by code words instead of in-depth analysis of where the founding fathers were coming from philosophically. Theirs was a religion, more of a civil religion that served the state, to which everybody could subscribe under a banner of patriotism. Adams was serving as a U.S. envoy to Britain during the drafting of the U.S. Constitution, so he didn't participate directly, but his voluminous writings certainly influenced the founders, in particular the Declaration of Independence. And so undiscerning Christians will often pour biblical content into their use of religious language in these documents. The American Constitution, for example, is unfortunately more a reflection of classical humanistic Enlightenment ideals than of biblical principles of civil government. And we're going to get into this in a bit more depth later in the course. But a paragraph-by-paragraph comparison shows how the Constitution contradicts the Bible in almost every paragraph. One obvious example of this is where the Constitution requires the return of a runaway slave, where the Bible forbids the return of a runaway slave. But the really critical issue is, what is the supreme law of the land? The Constitution declares itself, not the Bible, to be the supreme law of the land. And we have come to worship it, much like Jeroboam worshipped the golden calf and substituted it for the worship of Jehovah in obedience to the Word of God. But first, let's take another quiz on the life of John Adams to test your understanding. First of all, John Adams blossomed in the cloistered confines of the homeschool environment. True or false? Number 2, Adams was swept into office in the wake of Thomas Jefferson's Alien and Sedition Acts. True or false? 3, daily association with their peer group is essential for a child's social development. True or false? 4, John Adams achieved instant popularity in the colonies by prosecuting the British soldiers responsible for the Boston Massacre. And number 5, John Adams' cosmopolitan background served him well as ambassador to France. True or false? Okay, let's look at question number 1 first. John Adams blossomed in the cloistered confines of the homeschool environment. Kind of a trick question, but we're calling that false because he got out. His father took him to debates and town hall meetings and so forth. So we're calling that false. Question 2, Adams was swept into office in the wake of Thomas Jefferson's Alien and Sedition Acts. And that's false. The Alien and Sedition Acts came later during Jefferson's presidency. Number 3, daily association with their peer group is essential for a child's social development. That's false. Number 4, John Adams achieved instant popularity in the colonies by prosecuting the British soldiers responsible for the Boston Massacre. That's false. He defended those troops. Number 5, John Adams' cosmopolitan background served him well as ambassador to France. And that's false. He grew up on a farm. So that completes Lesson 4, and it completes the first part of our course. Next time, we're going to start on what are the nuts and bolts of a classical Christian education. So we'll see you tomorrow, Lord willing.